In this video, we are going to take a break from software development and talk about version control. So version control is software that records changes that we make to a project over time. So if we have our source code in version control, the version control software will watch and allow us to record each change that we make to the project. So when we add a new page to our application, or we add the router, or we add a new dependency, each of those could be a separate change that's recorded in the history of the project. So this allows us both to back up our code, back up our project, and allows us to collaborate with other programmers. So we're going to do a little bit of a conceptual overview of what version control is in this video, and then once we have the right mental framework for understanding version control, we will dive into actually setting up a project with version control and making some changes to that project over time. So what does version control look like? I am going to pull up a page from the Git book, which is a great resource for learning about Git. It has a ton of introductory basic material and a ton of advanced material in here as well. And all of this is online. I am just on the getting started page here to talk about, what does a project in version control look like? And there are a couple different flavors of version control. We're going to be using Git, which is distributed version control. So we'll take a look at that in a second. But like the most basic version of version control is just on your local computer. You have a project that has been stored with a series of versions, and each version is a snapshot of your project. So, that first version might be us just setting up the template of the project. The next version might be us adding the home page and then adding an about page as the third version. Each of those is its own snapshot of the project. Immediately, this gives us some benefits. Other than just having our code backed up, the fact that we have these different snapshots allows us to actually fly back through the history and check out previous versions of our application. Like maybe version 2 introduced a bug, we could fly back to that version, or we could fly back to version 1 before that bug was introduced to get something working. So this is a really simple model of a version control system. What we're going to be working with is Git, which is a distributed version control system, which means that on our computer, let's call our computer A, we have our database of the different versions of our application, so those different snapshots that changes over time. Our collaborator also has a copy of that history on their machine, on computer B. And there is also some server where we have a version of that history as well. So as we're working on our project and adding new versions, we are going to have to push that database to a server to sort of maintain the history of the project somewhere that's off of our computer. And then our collaborator can go ahead and pull things down from that server to their computer to get the most recent version of the database. So in the context of what we're going to be doing, Git is the version control software that we're going to be using to maintain these version histories. And then the server component, we're going to use a social coding platform, github.com, to act as our server, where we will actually be storing that version history for backup purposes and for allowing us to collaborate with other developers. So let's write that down on the whiteboard here because it is a confusing point. So we're going to be using Git, which is the version control software. Specifically, it's a distributed version control software that we'll be using. And it is a command line tool, or CLI. It has a command line interface for running Git commands. And then we're going to be using github.com as our social coding platform. So that means that when we talk about this server component, that is our github.com server. So we are pushing our history there so that other folks will be able to pull down that history and work on the project with us. It also has a lot of kind of social coding features. You can leave comments and review other people's code, etc. within the platform. So it's not just a server for hosting our version control history, but it has some other features that are really nice for collaborating with other developers. So Git is not the only version control software. There are other ones out there. And GitHub.com is not the only hosting platform for our version control data. These are just the two that we're going to be using in this class. To make things even more complicated, we're also going to use GitHub Desktop. And this is a graphical user interface for Git, which means that rather than having to open up our terminal every time to issue Git commands, we can actually use a user interface, click on buttons, type into text fields to do all of the Git things that we need to do. So a couple of setup things to do before we get started here. Make sure that you sign up for a github.com account. Make sure that you install GitHub Desktop, and I'll have links to these in below the video. And if you're on Windows, make sure that you've done our terminal setup and that we have Git Bash installed. If you're on Linux and Mac, you don't need to do this step. You'll be fine with the default terminal. And I'll also have a page here that's from the Git book that just shows how to install on a Mac if you happen to be on a Mac. One other note is that GitHub Desktop is not the only desktop client. It's not the only graphical user interface. And there is one that you can get access to as students for free, which is called GitKraken, which I'm a big fan of. So if you're already comfortable with the basics of working with Git, I would recommend grabbing GitKraken. But if you're following along for the first time and want to see exactly what to do, follow along with GitHub Desktop. Okay, let's take a look at an example repository. So I am on github.com. I'm looking at one of the repositories or projects in GitHub that I maintain. The content of this doesn't really matter. It's a tool for working with tile sets. If you're making games, that extrudes those tile sets so that you don't have visual artifacts. Again, that doesn't really matter. All I want to show you here is that when you go to a repository on github.com, you can actually see the history of that project. So here, what I am seeing is a snapshot, I'm seeing a list of all of the snapshots inside of this tile extruder library. And each snapshot has some important information associated with it. So if I go ahead and click on one of these snapshots, we can see a description that there's a typo in there, that I made. I was not paying close enough attention. So that's a user-defined description of what happened in this snapshot. So I added types to package.json, and then below that is a description of all of the things that have changed. So we can see here in the default view, what GitHub shows us is the previous version and then what was added. So we can actually track line by line what has changed from one version to the next. The other thing that this has is a commit hash. You'll also see this labeled as SHA, which you could call SHA or SHA, which has to do with the algorithm that's used for coming up with this hash. But this is a unique identifier to point to this commit. So each commit that we make, each snapshot, is going to have the changes that we've made, a description, and then a unique identifier that allows us to refer to that commit. So let's flip back to the whiteboard here. And thinking about version control, it's useful to do a little bit of diagramming before we actually try to make our own repository, because there are a lot of concepts and new terms that will be thrown around. So you can think of a repository or a project inside that's under version control as having this timeline of its history. So I'm going to represent that as a line going from left to right with these snapshots at different points in the history. And each of those snapshots is a commit, and it will have some message associated with it and some hash associated with it that uniquely identifies it. So if we're thinking about what we're going to do in this video, we're going to set up a new project. So our first commit might just say initial commit. And then it would have a list of what's changed. So maybe what we do in the first commit is just add a README file to our project and nothing else. And then it has some hash associated with it, which is going to be a sequence of letters and numbers that is used to identify that commit. So let's label this commit is a snapshot, and that's what we're looking at here. This whole thing is the repository, and as we're working on the project, we would add more commits. So after we did that initial README, maybe what we came in and did was add the home page for our application. So we could say add home page skeleton. I'm just going to throw some quotes around these to help distinguish that that's the commit message. Maybe what we changed was we added index.html. And again, you would have a hash down here. So make up some numbers and letters. And then again, the same process. So maybe the next feature we added was like our theme. So we added dark theme. And in this, we modified our index.html to bring in a CSS file, and we added a style.css. And again, this would have a hash associated with it too. So I don't know, we'll make up a bunch of zeros and a bunch of numbers and letters. And this process would continue. So every time we want to add something new to our project, we get a new commit, a new snapshot in that project. I'm not going to add anymore. I'm just going to put ... here. So what we get in our repository is a series of snapshots of our project at different moments in time that are all labeled with a message that's written by us. Each snapshot has a list of all of the files that have changed and also has our hash for identifying each commit uniquely. So let's label this, make sure that we get the word repository somewhere in here. This whole thing is our repository. You may hear me say repo for short for repository. And let's also label this is the SHA or SHA hash that uniquely identifies those commits. So this repository, if we connect it back to the graphic that we were seeing, is this version database where you've got version 1, 2, 3 here in a line. These are our different versions, our different snapshots. So this is a good starting place for us to think about our repositories. It's this series of snapshots that give us a history of the project. It gets a little bit more complicated when we think about maintaining this server that also has a history associated with it. And I'll make sure that this cheat sheet is in the description as well. But there are actually a couple of things we need to think about when we are thinking about our repository and how changes propagate through the repository. So we're going to kind of take this diagram and dissect it in our whiteboard. this is showing you the different mental models you should have. That you have a working directory, those are your files on your computer. You have this staging area where you are picking things to add to a snapshot. You have your local repository, which is that full history of the project. And then you have your remote repository, which is on, say, github.com servers, that is storing the remote version, the backup of our project history. So let's take this and do another diagram here. So you have your working directory, and your working directory, okay, it's gonna bug me that I didn't put that centered. So let's go back. Here we go, working directory. This you can think of as just the files that are on your computer. So in our project here, if I draw a little like folder, that's where things are on our computer, and maybe what we have is this list of files. We have this README that's in here, and we said we had an index.html in here. And we had maybe a style.css file in here. Working directory, this is just the current contents of your folder, your repository on your computer. So I'll just say contents of project folder. These are not by default in your Git history. They are not in these snapshots until you actually take them from your working directory and get them into your repository history. That process involves, I'm going to draw this in an outline box, your staging area. So the way this works is that you decide which files from your working directory you want to get ready to add to a snapshot. You add them to this staging area, and then we can take that full staging area, label it, and add it as a commit into our history. So let's pretend that we're at this place in our repository. We've got the dark theme, so all three of these are in our history. And what we do is come in and we're adding, let's call it main.js. So what we would do is we would say, okay, this new file that we've added, let's throw it into our staging area. And to get this JavaScript set up on our page, we also had to change our HTML file. So we brought that over to our staging area as well. So our stage is now set. This we can label as the selected changes. And once we've staged those, we can move on to actually getting them into this history. So if I were to draw this, how we have it currently, we've got these 3 points in history for these 3, the initial commit, the index, the style.css. And what we're trying to do is add this new set of changes as a commit. So we're grabbing all of this and we are adding it here at the end of our history. And this would be committing our changes. And if we label this up here, this would be our local repository or repo. And so far, so good. We have our history in our local repo, but we have not talked about getting it into our server like we have in our diagram here. So we're all on computer A. So the last piece of this diagram is our remote repo. So our remote repo is, for our purposes, this is going to be github.com, where we're storing things on the server, and this is going to be on our computer. What we need to do is make sure that we get this history synced with our remote repository. So we want to make sure that at the end of the day, those 4 pieces of history are in our remote repository. So this would be push changes to remote. So we've got our working directory, our contents that are on our inside of our project folder, all the changes that we've made to any of them. We select them to bring them into the staging area. We commit them to get them into a snapshot, and then we push that to our remote repository. And that, if you can keep that in your head, that is what we're seeing in this cheat sheet here. So you've got your working directory where you add things to your stage, you then commit things to bring them into your local repository, and then you push things to get them into your remote repository. And there's a similar pathway for going from the remote repository into your local repository, or remote repository into your working directory. These words that you're seeing here are the actual commands that you would use in Git. So you'd say like git add to put something into the stage. Or if you want to pull the remote repository into your working directory, you could say git pull to do that. So I realize that this is a lot if it's your first time entering the world of version control, but having all of this mental model in your head will help you when we now move into actually creating a repository and doing these steps. And I'll just add another note that this is a simplified version of how Git and GitHub work. You can actually have multiple branches. So what we've got going on here is a single branch, like one history of your project. You can actually maintain parallel versions, divergent versions of your project, and you have ways to manage bringing those back together at some point in the future. All right, so we've covered version control, we've talked about Git, GitHub, GitHub Desktop, and hopefully we have all of those tools set up at this point. In the next video, we are actually going to dive into taking these ideas and putting them into practice. We will make an application from scratch. It'll just be a simple website where we add a README, and then we add a homepage, and then we style it, and then we add some JavaScript to see what this process looks like in practice.